This is Contra Zoom, where we go back and forth about film. I'm your host, Dakota, and today we are going to recap the Oscars that just happened. But today, I have a very special guest in Thom Ernst. You may know him as the former host of TVO's Saturday Night at the Movies, where for 8 years he presented films airing on the network. The podcast, This Movie's About You, where they brought on a new guest each episode to talk about film. And you can read his reviews on Original Sin, a film-based website. Thank you for joining me today. How are you doing, Thom?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Well, this is awesome that I get to have a real film critic here to talk some film with me.
Oh, I'm sure you've had them before. Not the first.
So we're going to talk about the 92nd Academy Awards, which were just held the day prior to us recording. It was a very interesting night. Parasite was the big winner. Did you enjoy the show?
I've always enjoyed the show. Always enjoyed the Oscars, and I've been watching them completely since I was about 15. Started watching them in part when I was 10. My parents would never let me finish them. So now I think it's really easy to be cynical of the Oscar awards. I think it's really easy to be cynical about people going up and applauding themselves and each other and patting themselves on the back, and movies that you didn't particularly like getting noticed, movies that you loved getting not getting noticed. So yesterday's show, I think, was one of the most balanced shows as far as reception, audience reception, critical reception, and people at home watching on television. I try to stay off of Twitter while I'm watching the Oscars because I get angry about people's cynicisms. But if you are going to be on Twitter, Gee Willikers. Did I say Gee Willikers? Follow Norm Wilner from Now Magazine. That guy is funny. So even when he's being caustic, I enjoy him. So the yesterday's show really worked for me. I liked it very much.
Well, that's good to hear. I appreciate that you said that.
Gee Willikers?
Yeah, especially that part.
Yeah.
I also feel the same way, where sometimes a lot of people can get bogged down in the idea of, well, it means nothing, or, you put too much emphasis on it. And I feel like if you just go in to enjoy it for what it is, a silly night.
It is a fun night. It's nothing more than that. And if you do want to talk about politics, if you do want to talk about the Joaquin Phoenix is getting up there, and I thought the night politically was Brad Pitt's. If you want to talk about that and say they're actors, they're just star in movies, they aren't politicians. Well, they are people. They are people of that nation, and they're of whatever nation they happen to be representing or speaking about. And we cannot forget that a really good artist, and they may not be the actors particularly, but a really good artist and a really good art represents society. It interpretates what we see in society. So yes, by all means, if you are a performer, you have every right to take that opportunity and speak your mind.
In fact, that's an argument I always find frustrating, because art is inherently political to begin with.
Yes.
And you can't really separate the two, and you can't say, shut up and sit down at points like that, because this is the time that you're giving them their soapbox.
And the only time people say shut up and sit down is when somebody says something they don't like.
Exactly, yeah.
So, and you will argue, really, is Ford and Ferrari a political movie? Is that art? We both knew that it was an entertaining film and that it didn't have a chance of winning much, but it won something. And there are those films, but most of the films that were represented yesterday had a real artistic edge, and also, though they were celebrated. And I'm thinking of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I'm thinking of Jojo Rabbit. As much as they were celebrated, they also had the alternate view of people who absolutely hated them. And that is the sign of a good political, artful film.
I like that. That's great. I was sitting in a room. I went to a small Oscar party, and I think there was about 8 of us. And there was definitely some heated conversations, especially surrounding Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Joker, that came up several times as well, where there were some very strong opinions about those movies. How do you normally watch the Oscars? Were you by yourself? Were you watching with other people?
This is the first year I wasn't invited to an event.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so
your invitation got lost in the mail.
It must have.
Yes.
No, I usually host an evening of some sort. When I worked at Saturday Night at the Movies, I would host my own Oscar party for the people who I worked with, and we would dress up and we would pretend. So that was always fun. Once I left Saturday Night at the Movies, I got invited to do events, big events like at the Bloor Cinema or something like that. those have sort of faded and gone there, gone another path. It's a generational thing. People want someone who's younger, I understand, and someone who, I get that. That's fine. And then I started hosting my own event at places like the National Club. And the person I usually do that with is in the Philippines right now, so couldn't do it. Long answer to this, I was home alone. My wife is in Berlin working, and I was home alone. I bought myself a bottle of wine. I tried to get my daughter into it. I made the mistake of getting her to watch the red carpet, and by the time that went on for an hour and a half...
She was done?
She was done. She went upstairs to watch Grey's Anatomy and on my computer, so I watched it by myself with my cat.
Oh, well, hey, you can still have a fun time on your own.
Yeah, I did have a good time.
That's good.
Yes, I did have a good time. And as I said, I stayed off of Twitter except to check in with Norm Wilner every now and then. That guy is hilarious.
All right. This was the second straight year that there was no host. Frankly, I'm kind of a fan of the no-host format. I feel like it's a no-win gig where you have to be a certain level of celebrity in order to actually get it, and then you have to toe the line. You have to be family-friendly. You also have to be a little bit edgy. You have to be funny, but not too funny, and take away from the show. There's literally no way to win that. And now this is the second year in a row where they've gone no-host, and just... I think they've allowed the presenters to have a bit more time and be a bit more themselves, and I think it really works out strongly. There were a few really strong duos with Steve Martin and Chris Rock. They sort of kicked it off of like, hey, we're the former hosts, we're not invited back. And then Kristen Wiig and Maya Rudolph were terrific as well, and Will Ferrell and Julia Louis-Dreyfus. Did that format work for you?
Well, the three that you mentioned, three pairs that you mentioned, I thought two of those were exceptional. I thought one failed miserably, but I will say this. Then that would be the Steve Martin, Chris Rock bit. I will say that I got a phone call. Who calls you when the Oscars are on? I got a phone call just as they come on stage, so I was trying to listen with both ears. So I didn't think that bit worked. I thought the Maya Rudolph bit and Kristen, obviously Kristen Stewart, Kristen
Wiig.
Thank you, Wiig. And I thought they were hilarious. And I wasn't certain that the Will Ferrell bit was going to work, and I thought it did. You know what I thought was a hilarious duo? Was Diane Keaton.
And Keanu Reeves.
Okay. All right. Okay, you could think that she just came out and did her Annie Hall bit. And I thought it was actually hilarious. It was a little uncomfortable because you're not sure if she did it on purpose or not. But, and you don't know if, is this an age thing? Is this a I don't really care thing? I thought it was funny. I just thought her sort of rambling, sort of Annie Hall, sort of drifting off into nowhere was a funny bit. And whether it was a bit of reality... I enjoyed it. I haven't read what people are saying about it just yet, but I will.
Yeah, I haven't yet either, so I don't really know. This is all what I'm feeling.
But I miss a host.
Do you? Who do you think that they need to be able to do this? Like, obviously, I don't think they'd get someone like Ricky Gervais, where I feel like he's sort of worn out his welcome with the Golden Globes, despite how popular he has been there. Do you have someone in mind?
Well, I think choosing a host for the Oscars... is the equivalent of choosing who's going to be the next Batman villain. You have because you would look, who's going to play the Joker. That's as cool. That's one of those cool things. Also, who's going to write the theme song for the next James Bond movie? These are sort of chalices. These are the brass rings that people go for. So, who's going to be the next host of the Oscar is always interesting. I was surprised they didn't bring Ellen DeGeneres back more often. I thought she really nailed it. Okay, I think there should be a host, but I think what they need is not a person necessarily to do it, an actor. What they need is a character to do it. So I submit, even though they're not a movie yet, I submit that they bring the Rose family in from Schitt's Creek. And I think that all of them do it. And I don't think we need Eugene Levy and Catherine O'Hara. We need Mrs. Rose, Mr. Rose. We need, we need the kids. And I think they're perfect. Can you imagine Johnny Rose up there going, well, how can I make this work for my career? And, is it Maya Rose? His wife?
I'm blanking on her name.
Catherine O'Hara's character.
Yes.
She would be up there thinking everybody still thinks she's a star, right? And of course their son, played by
Dan Levy.
He would be neurotic about everything, thinking everyone's talking behind his back, reading every snub. And Alexis, well, she would have had some kind of connection with him in there. I think the Rose family from Schitt's Creek should be the host of the Oscars in character.
I like that idea.
Yeah, I feel
like
work.
David Rose would probably rival Billy Porter for who would be the best dressed man at the Oscars.
Okay, now let's talk. Can we talk about Billy Rose for a second?
Billy Porter?
About Billy Porter
Yes.
for a second.
Go ahead.
My daughter, this she watched, and I wasn't allowed to say anything bad about anyone on camera. I was just not, that's one of the rules. So as much as I don't like people being cynical, my daughter thinks I can be cynical. So she said, I thought great. He was fantastic at the Grammys, I thought. I thought he blew it on the red carpet. He kept having a look at his cue cards. He didn't know what to say. His interview with Spike Lee, I don't know if that was Spike's fault or his, but I think that fell flat. He called, who did he call? Oh my God, Laura Dern, as an older actress. There's so many ways to word that.
Yeah.
I don't know. And I kind of mentioned that. My daughter gave me heck for saying anything negative about him. She adores the man. I think he's colorful. I think he's entertaining. I think he has a great voice. I think he dresses amazing. But I don't know if he's red carpet interview material.
I felt all of the red carpet interviewees were quite bad, frankly.
Thank you. Weren't they? Yes.
They were very awkward. They didn't seem to know what they were talking about or how to relate to them.
No, and there was several, Brad Pitt threw some really great lines on the red carpet, and she missed them all. She missed. Are there any? What did she say? Is there any romance to talk about after he talks about his friendship with
Leo? Yeah,
Leo. Yeah. And she says, is there a romance to talk about? He just says, I'm not going there. I mean,
yeah.
I don't know. I thought that, and as a former interviewer. Who doesn't have a whole lot of gigs, I'm thinking, hey, I'll step in. I could do that gig.
I could do it. Yeah. This year, we were talking off the top of the show about how the Oscars are always sort of political, and this year there were several moments, and you specified Brad Pitt's there. But I felt overall it was more political than it was in recent years. You had many of the presenters making comments about the lack of people of color being nominated or the lack of female directors being acknowledged. And then you had some of the winners like Harlow for animated short and Brad Pitt and Joaquin Phoenix. And it seemed like it was one after another. Everyone was making a very pointed political speech that was aimed at a very different person throughout the night, whether it's someone in the audience or overall for the viewers or the Academy as a whole. Did you think it went a little too overboard, or do you think that they needed their fingers to be pointed out at them?
I don't think referencing female directors by identifying them as vaginas is a great political statement. Neither is it that funny. I think that was a misfire. I also felt that a lot of the moments were the Academy making up for perceived, well, not just perceived, they actually, there are areas that they did ignore. Women, there was only one person of color, I think.
Cynthia Erivo, yeah.
And so they were ignoring that. They needed to be addressed. But when they're addressed by the Academy, it doesn't actually come across as a political statement. When the Academy brings out somebody to rap halfway through and talk about there's room enough here for everyone to shine, that's beautiful. But when the Academy does it, it wasn't somebody being honored. It wasn't somebody on stage who did it spontaneously. It was it was devised. And it felt like you're not going to, it felt like it was trying to distract us. It felt like they were saying, hey, we didn't, there's no women here for director, but look at what else we're doing. It was a little bit of a sleight of hand that I wasn't quite buying. I know that I listened to Rad, who was on CBC this morning, talk about how he did appreciate that. Rad Voice is one of a film critic who is represented or not represented by these choices, etc. So I think his word has weight, and he did really like it. So and that does make me stop and think, okay, is that an adequate Band-Aid? But still, it's just a Band-Aid. I think the only way you're going to get around these things is to actually have, to look at who's voting. And I think that's got to change. It's a nice effort. I think the effort was to sort of balance the imbalance that was in the show. But it felt like, I don't know, it felt like someone coming up to me, a child perhaps, and saying and that I caught them doing something wrong, and they would say, yeah, but look what else so-and-so is doing. Or, yeah, but I did this, or I'll promise to do that. Okay, I started this off by saying let's not be cynical about the Oscars. I think maybe I was a bit cynical about that.
No, I think you absolutely have a point. There's a difference between Joaquin Phoenix and Brad Pitt making a speech after they win and saying what's on their mind and how they're feeling versus the Academy spending 2 weeks to a month writing, the 2-minute speech that Martin Short and Chris Rock are saying with their help or without their help, whatever it is.
Yeah,
and
it
there's
sounded
a bit of
like
a
it was without their help.
At times, yes.
I'm sorry, you liked it though.
I don't know how I felt totally about it. I think I appreciate that they acknowledged it, but it was sort of, it reminded me a bit when the La La Land Moonlight fiasco happened, where the entire next year every joke was about that, and it's like, okay, put it to bed. You can't keep making the same joke over and over again. And it sort of felt similarly, where it sort of kept harping on the same points. And I got it. I understood. Maybe I'm not the person that needs to be convinced. Maybe it's someone that still is more on the fence about this subject matter, about, Oscar so white and things like that. So I think maybe I'm not the right person to answer this question. Was it too much? Was it not enough? Was it too pointed? Was it too scripted? Things like that.
I thought it was too scripted. Yeah. But yeah, it's all interesting. And just to point out the big flub, I think, and you brought up the La La Land Moonlight thing. Why did they not start off the next year's Oscars by giving the Moonlight people their chance to do their speeches? Drove me nuts. They turned the lights down on them. They won the Best Picture. People don't even remember that. They don't remember the name of the director. Most people. A lot of people just remembered La La Land. Boy, if I had made Moonlight, or if I was a viable voice for that community, I would be up in arms. The one chance, and a really great chance, LGBTQ rights were identified in this. Diversity was identified by this film, and it got completely swept away by an all-white movie. Oh, sure, It was about jazz, but why no one thought to give that director, those actors, that film, the acknowledgement it deserved to kick off the next Oscar seasons was probably the biggest misstep in the history of the Oscars.
I think that's a really interesting point. Moving on, we'll talk maybe a little bit about the different musical performances. Was there any that were a standout for you of the 5 nominees specifically?
Of the nominees? No, I if ever there's a point where I like to leave and make a sandwich, it's during the musical performances. Although for me, it's like the way I identify watching a hospital TV drama. As a kid, I never wanted to see them, but whenever my mom would turn them on, I would sit and go kind of get into them. So that happens to me with the music events. I did think, I don't know what people are saying about Billie Eilish. I thought that was a heart rendition of that
Yesterday.
song.
Yeah.
Yesterday. I thought that was beautiful. I don't know what people thought. You might have loved about that at the end when she looked to her brother and he applauded her. Mm-hmm. I think they're probably really good siblings together. Mm-hmm. That touched me. I did, at the opening, I thought she was off key at first. And I thought, oh, this is bombing. And then when it got to the big number, and I love the fact that they were celebrating even. I love the fact that they were celebrating Dolomite, which is one of the biggest misses the Oscars had. What a great movie. Wouldn't you have loved to have seen Wesley Snipes up there? Wouldn't you have loved to have seen Eddie Murphy? You know, and then also one of my favorite horror movies of the year was Midsommar, and that was there. And I thought, geez, how, you know, probably because Florence was in the audience. Her performance in that movie, and have you seen Midsommar?
That is one of my few misses this year that I've not seen.
Her performance is fantastic. We could talk about that some other time. When I'm talking about music. So I did like it because I'm a Broadway fan, and I like Broadway musicals. So the big Broadway dance numbers always work for me when they're done right. And then she did a shout out to the LGBTQ community, and that was great. And I thought Randy Newman, I thought his song was, who I usually love, I thought his song was really repetitive.
Yes.
And I didn't know how he got in there, and he got a standing ovation. I thought that was nice, but I thought, and I did think his song was lively, it just was too repetitive. I love seeing Elton John up there, and I loved Eminem in there. I thought he was great.
That was definitely a surprise.
It was a huge surprise, and I kept wondering why he was there. Am I missing something?
No, the room that I was in, it was very confusing. We're like, why is this happening? And there were some people that weren't enjoying it as much. And I enjoyed it. I love that song. I love that movie. And I was like, maybe it's the anniversary of it or something. And so my wife looked it up, and she's like, I think it's the 17th anniversary or something like that.
Yeah, who celebrates that?
Yeah, so that's not really an anniversary. I know he just put out a new album recently, so maybe this is a part of his promotional tour to get back in the spotlight. I don't really know. But it was certainly odd, but I appreciate it. I really liked it.
Yeah, did he get a mofo in there at one point?
I think it was pretty close.
Yeah, I wondered about that, and it must have been really hard for him not to. But I think he's a consummate performer. I loved watching the audience reaction, even Scorsese, who looked a bit. There
were a few that were a little confused about it, but I think for the most part they really got into it.
Yeah, and I love to see that he got a standing ovation.
Yeah, interesting. All right. I think we've danced around the winners long enough, and we should maybe talk about how the results came in. Obviously, everyone knows by now that Parasite is the big winner. It is the first non-English language film ever to win Best Picture. It swept it didn't sweep, but it won 4 awards, all of them very big. Bong Joon-ho winning 4 himself. Incredible. What were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I never thought it was going to happen. I thought it was going to win a Best International Film. And so glad the way it turned out, because it is a great film. You know, I would not have been unhappy if Once Upon a Time in Hollywood had won, only because I think that is a really artful movie, and I think it's so easily misunderstood. Really, really, really happy if Irishman had won. Because, but these are all sort of personal. I can't say Irishman is better than Parasite, and I can't say Parasite is better than Irishman. I do think Irishman and Parasite are better than all the other films in the category, though they were good. But I was thrilled. Again, this is where I just sort of watched the show and accept it. There's only been a handful of times, if even that I thought, how did that movie win? Where I really disliked the winning movie. It's not often. That would have been Driving Miss Daisy, which I just could not buy.
It's terrible.
Yeah, and
then the sequel to it, Green Book.
I liked it.
Did you?
I liked Green Book. Okay. No, I liked Green Book for a lot of reasons. Is that I think do you want me to talk about Green Book?
If you got a bit, say it.
Well, all I will say is I think Green Book was not about a man who, I don't think it was a white savior movie. Mm-hmm. Again, I do recognize this is not my battle to fight. Mm-hmm. And I can, in those cases, I hand it over to those who it matters to and who it affects more. Personally, all I can do is sit down and watch the film and enjoy it. And what I loved about this movie is, I knew I could phone up my sister and tell her my sisters are much older than I am. So I could say, you'll love this movie and know that they will. B, I thought it was wonderful the way movies of this type are always about some guy who thinks he's better than the interracial sort of foil that he plays off of. In this case, he did not. It didn't even register. And that was a surprise for me. And also in the scene, not to ruin it for people who haven't seen the movie, but the scene where he catches him in a compromising position, in an era of which that particular compromising position is not accepted, he had no judgment. Mm. That's what I liked about the movie. The film, it ended awfully. It had an awful ending. But other than that, I liked the film.
Well, I appreciate your insight on that.
Oh, well, whatever it's worth.
For this year, as far as the Best Picture goes, I feel like I'm a bit in the minority of I liked it just under quite a bit. I didn't love it. If I were to rank my movies for the year, it's probably going to end up maybe in the top 25. It's not going to be in the top 10 for me. But
wow, it doesn't make your top 10.
No, it does not. And I know that's a bit of a sacrilegious thing to say because people are so passionate about this movie. And I appreciate all the twists and turns that it did. I just feel that the last act was so much of a departure from the first two acts that it just didn't quite work for me. I've only seen it the once. I saw it in theaters, and that was a few months ago when it first came out, and I know I need to rewatch it, especially now that it's won. And maybe, what did I get wrong? What did I not appreciate?
That's interesting. I mean, but certainly people are passionate about the film, but here's where I think film criticism and the love of cinema goes awry, is that so passionate that it becomes angry. Mm-hmm. And I will never get angry about someone's take on a film. What I do get angry about is people being telling me or bullying me into their particular, corralling me into their beliefs and being bullying. And this happens on Twitter a lot. And I can name the movie that I think this is particularly true of. So you're not liking Parasite not getting into your top 10 is really interesting for someone who loves cinema, because I can't think of 10 films. I mean, I certainly can't think of 25 films that are necessarily better than Parasite. I mean,
there were three in the Best Picture category alone for me. 1917, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and Little Women were all some of my favorites of the year.
See, I didn't like 1917.
Okay. That seems to be also another one that's a little bit divisive.
Yeah.
Where I'm finding out where I everyone I've talked to for the most part is like, oh yeah, I loved it. And then I'm hearing a dissenting opinion. I'm like, oh, I didn't know someone felt that way about it. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
That's one that's kind of caught me by surprise a little bit, the critiques of it, which when I'm hearing them, I understand it completely. I understand where people are coming from. But the critiques that people dislike about it is what worked for me. I appreciate it.
So you liked the fact that it looked like one shot. You liked the fact that not all scenes were directed by the eyes. So where, like there was a lot of emptiness going on. You liked that.
Yes.
And those were aspects I did not like. And worst of all, I think it's worse offense. And people have told me I'm being really, really picky. The scene in the farmhouse.
Okay.
The tragedy that happens there. Mm-hmm. The next thing we know is just on the other side of the farm is a whole train. Troops, like hundreds and hundreds of trucks and men that nobody noticed prior to this. It drove me crazy. It took me right out of the movie.
That is something that I've heard some complaints about as well, and I don't have an answer for that with the plot device.
Right, and if I was with the movie, I'd probably forgive it. Mm-hmm. But the fact is, I wasn't with the movie. I recognized that there were elements that were good about the film, and I love the Hitchcockian twist that happens at the farmhouse. Mm-hmm. Hitchcockian twist being this cycle where you think you're being with this one character and that switches. Mm-hmm. But yeah, 1917. I recognize it as it's a good film. Mm-hmm. I did, of all the films there, except for maybe Ford versus Ferrari, I thought that was the weakest.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there was, and I thought Little Women was fabulous. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting. My favorite film of the last year was Last Black Man, San Francisco, which was never in contention for anything at the Oscars.
And hardly anyone saw that film, and that is such a vital, important, and great movie. Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's a movie I constantly try to flag when people say, have you seen anything great? And I always throw that one out. And it's underrated. It's not highly seen. And
did you ever see Columbus from a few years ago by Kogonada?
Don't think I have.
No? Okay. I find that they're very similar, where they're both very aesthetically pleasing shot films where everything is right angles and beautiful architecture and things like that. And it's a very interesting story where it's a Korean man who is returned to the U.S. after his father has gotten ill, who is a famous architect, and so he doesn't have the emotional attachment to his father's buildings, but he meets this young woman, Haley Lou Richardson, who is in love with his father's architecture, and so they have a nice little bonding, and it's very similar to Last Black Man, San Francisco, where your emotional attachment to the city defines who you are as a person as well, which is something I really appreciate, because I know not everyone feels the same way about Toronto, but I love living in this city. I feel a very rich, deep connection to it, and I know the buildings aren't pretty like they are in Last Black Man, San Francisco, but that same sort of resonance of feeling connected to the roots of it.
When you discover little areas of Toronto where the architect is really quite splendid, there's not a lot of old buildings for us to appreciate. We got City Hall doesn't count, but once you get to the courthouses, those are nice. Mm-hmm. University of Toronto has a lot. But some of the new architecture, and I was just walking through, what area of town was I walking through the other day? And, the Esplanade.
Okay.
And it's really a street that is unique all on its own, with all the pubs and stuff. And it's very a sports-centric kind of area. Yet there was something about the feel of walking down that street that I thought, this is unique to Toronto. And it's hidden. Mm-hmm. And then when you go up a side street, it becomes Old Montreal for just a brief moment. So there's lots to like. And what you're talking about is, I think, this is what Woody Allen has done a lot in his career, particularly with films like Manhattan. Mm-hmm. The love of architect and architecture and cinema and storytelling, yeah.
It really could be its own subgenre of movies, of architecture-based cinema.
We did that on Saturday Night at the Movies.
Oh, interesting.
We did a series, and we brought in all our architects from Toronto, famed and otherwise, and we showed Manhattan, and I can't remember, I wish to goodness I remember the second film. Movie about it, oh my gosh, it's about the Atlas Shrugged. Anyway, it'll come to me. Oh God. Anyway, it is about an architect who and King Vidor, I think, directed it. And he's an architect who wants perfection. Mm. It's a very interesting movie, filmed beautifully by King Vidor.
Okay, I'll have to look into that.
Yeah, sorry, I can't remember the title. Right. Famous book by Ayn Rand.
Atlas Shrugged? That's the only one I can think of hers.
Is it? It could be Atlas Shrugged, actually. Anyway, your listeners know what I'm talking about.
All right, going back to Parasite, were you surprised that it ended up winning? Because I still felt that there was going to be a bit of a Roma hangover where it's not that... I don't think it's the right time, but some of the voters, I think they're still trying to diversify the voter base, and I think it's still not diverse enough. And I thought the same thing that was going to happen, where I had was hoping for Roma to win last year, and it didn't. And I was wondering if the same thing was going to happen again this year, which obviously it didn't. So it completely flips the narrative on its head.
Mm-hmm. So just so we set the record straight, I did not think Green Book was the best picture of the year. I thought Roma was. I liked it.
Okay.
And I didn't think Green Book would win. That was a shock. So again, I did not think Parasite would win. 1917 was my, when people asked me to do forms for them, 1917, without question, I had no doubt was going to be the winning movie. And I thought Scorsese was, without question, going to be the winning director.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I'm not disappointed with how it turned out, but this is what I thought voters would do. I did not know. I thought, it's going to be put into Best International Film. It's going to win that. And like he said, when he got up there, I thought I had the rest of the night off.
Yeah, I think he really did believe that was the end of him going up there.
Yeah.
For me, there was two things that tipped me off of my change, because I believe 1917 was going to win both picture and director. When original screenplay went to Parasite, that was my first little alarm bell going off of like, oh, maybe things aren't going the way I was thinking it was. And then in the sound categories, when 1917 didn't get both of them and one went to Ford versus Ferrari, that was the other alarm bell that went that it wasn't 1917's night. It looked like things were definitely going to turn towards Parasite. And then by the time Bong Joon-ho won Best Director, obviously I think it had sealed its fate that it was obviously going to be called up again.
Wow, that's good. I'm not that good at figuring things out like that. I go by my gut, and my gut has failed me many times on these Oscar polls. But if I had gone on air to do something, and predicted, my predictions would have been way off. I think in that case, for the first while, I was bang on. Renee was going to win for Judy. That was no question. Joaquin was going to win for the Joker. That Brad was going to win. And Laura Dern was going to win, and I just thought I had it all sealed. But this one threw me for a loop. And
that's interesting. I was just about to transition to that as well. I think this is the first time in a very long time that all four acting categories have been such locks from way beginning before the nominations even came out. Usually there's at least one or two of the categories where it's like, oh, it could be this person or this person. But this time it was from the get-go. These were the four people. They won every single award along the way. The Golden Globes, the BAFTAs, the Critics' Choice Awards, everything like that. And it just was a steamroll to the finish. And I was a little surprised, but it became very anticlimactic last night during the ceremony.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But when we do see the lineup of who's going to win, particularly, actually in the acting categories, there's no way you're going to look at any of those people and say they don't deserve an award. Mm-hmm. No matter who it is. You would just say, okay, this is the most popular award. This is the one that's getting the most press. But, Leonardo was fantastic, and he didn't, for Best Actor for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Any of those actors could have gone up there and won. Mm-hmm. So it becomes less, you're right, it becomes less of, who's going to win, who's going to walk away with this. I don't think it's ever the case that you can't get those categories right. Mm-hmm. I think it's always sort of locked right after the nominations. You kind of know who's going to walk up there.
Yeah, I agree for the most part, but there'll still sometimes I feel like there's one of the four categories that will be a little bit up in the air. Like if Joaquin Phoenix had already won an Oscar before, I think he partially won because of the fact that he's never won an Oscar before, because the Oscars are always trying to play catch up with what they're doing. If he won for The Master or something like that.
Which he should have.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
And then the story becomes, is it Adam Driver's turn? So then it becomes, is it Joaquin Phoenix or is it Adam Driver? And then, maybe at the BAFTAs, Adam Driver wins Best Actor, and suddenly the narrative changes a little bit, even though Phoenix wins most of the other precursors. And then there's still a little bit of a mystery. This time there's just absolutely none for it at all. Even if most years there is you can go, I'm 90% sure these are who are going to be the four winners. And this year, that I feel like that was completely taken away.
Yeah. I was not a fan of Judy and Renee Zellweger. I think her performance was fine, was great, but the movie was so not. The movie didn't work at all. I'm not even going to preface that by saying the movie didn't work for me. It just didn't work, and so that really left a bad taste in my mouth, even about her performance, which was again fine, and we knew she was going to win. But I would have loved to have seen somebody else. Remind me of who were some of the other...
Well, there was Saoirse Ronan for Little Women, Scarlett Johansson for Marriage Story, and then what was it? Cynthia Erivo for Harriet, and Charlize Theron for Bombshell.
Okay. Out of those, even now I would have to say, okay, hers is the most obvious choice.
I would have preferred Saoirse Ronan if it was me.
Yeah.
But I'm in the exact same boat where I thought it was a perfectly fine performance, really good. It's nice to see Renee Zellweger back in the spotlight, but that movie is completely forgettable.
Completely. And you know what? These biographical films, as far as I'm concerned, biographical films never work unless you take a step outside of reality and you're not trying to recapture the truth. I think truth is this sounds absurd, and I've actually said this in front of an audience and was taken to task for it, but I believe it's true that the best films about artists are the ones that are furthest from the truth. And what I think is, Born to be Blue.
Love that one.
It's so good.
Yeah.
It's not true.
Mm-hmm.
That story is not true. But it tells you a truth. And that's what, in fact, fiction does. Fiction tells you a truth that you can, that somehow relates to a deeper sense. When you try to be factual, all you're going to do is miss something, tell it in the wrong way, or hit people over the head. And all people are doing is saying, I remember that point, that point, that point, that point. And you get a catalog, you don't get a film. That's why I thought Rocket Man was so much better than Bohemian Rhapsody, is because it became a fantasy. It became something else. So we got a sense of what this character, Elton John, was feeling and was like in his experience, not from facts, but from emotions and from trigger points.
I agree. I think if they had done away with the rehab counseling scenes, that movie would be easily a top 10 film for me because how imaginative it was. And it was very much like a Broadway show, it felt like.
And it should be. If Elton John's life is not an internal Broadway show, then, when they do Billy Porter's life, did I say his name right? Billy?
Yes.
Yeah. Billy Porter's life. I think, too, it should take that kind of fanciful look,
Yes.
Unless the struggle is about fighting against that and the things that that it takes for someone to be who they are, to be original. Because I think there is a struggle to be original in this world, and particularly cinema and film is finally getting around to acknowledging that. Being who you are, no matter what boundaries are broken, long as they're not illegal boundaries, what boundaries are broken is fair game, and allowing that. I think that's becoming more and more true. I think maybe part of the problem with the Billy Porter Spike Lee interaction is I wasn't sure where Spike Lee was on this whole thing. Spike Lee looked like he might have been not happy to have been there, which would be very sad if that is the case.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, I'm not saying it is the case, but it crossed my mind.
I can't speak too highly. I can't speak too thoroughly about the red carpet stuff because there was a lot of commotion going on. I was getting drinks, things like that. So I was very in and out of the entire red carpet experience.
You were getting drinks?
So people were showing up, catching up, things like that.
Was here,
it was at a friend's house.
Okay.
I just want to feel like I gotta get this in because you're talking about the biopics. I think a movie that perfectly captures your idea of what a good biopic should be is "I'm Not Here" or "I'm Not There," the Bob Dylan one.
Exactly, and that's I found that movie really confusing, and I was in and out of that film with it and not with it, but so creative, and I'm sorry. when I did say this whole thing about reality is better realized through fantasy, I said it in front of a number of documentarians. So, of course, that didn't fly. But I wasn't talking about documentary films.
Yes.
I was talking about, if you're going to do a documentary on someone's life, then yes, you do have to take a different, more realistic approach to it.
But we've also learned earlier this year, or last year, Bob Dylan once again threw that convention out the window with Rolling Thunder Review. Did you catch that?
Yes.
Halfway through, I'm like, why is this movie frustrating me so much? Because I went in knowing nothing about it other than that it was a Bob Dylan Scorsese movie. Afterwards, I was reading up and I was like, this explains why this movie was so frustrating to watch, but it was so enrapturous. What's real, what isn't, and completely threw everything about what documentary filmmaking is out the window for a biopic as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think any film that frustrates you in a way that encourages you to want to read about it more, which is what you did, is a sign of a good film. It doesn't mean you have to end up liking it. There are good films that I dislike. I recognize they're good movies, and I recognize they've done something, but what they've done has triggered something personally or emotionally for me, or even intellectually for me, mostly emotional, but that makes me want to separate myself from the film. But it doesn't take away from the fact that it's still a good piece of work. And the movie that I always sort of think of is The Conformist.
I don't know that one.
Oh, it's an early Bertolucci film. And it's... I've tried and tried again. And I won't tell you the other film because it will discredit me completely. I'll tell you off the mic. Yeah.
Well, what you're saying, that's Parasite for me this year.
Yeah.
I can 100% appreciate everything that Bong Joon-ho was doing with that, what he was crafting in that house, how that was so much a part of the movie as well, and the layers to that, and what he was trying to tell with this class structure. I was fully on board. There was a little bit that just didn't click for me. And unfortunately, that it just didn't work.
Yeah, no, and that's fine. And there are movies that I go back to, because you say you'll see it again. Most often, I like movies better the second time I see them. And then I'll see them too much, Pulp Fiction, and all of a sudden the flaws that people who don't like Pulp Fiction keep throwing at me suddenly start surfacing. Mm-hmm. And then I'll go back a couple of years later and like it again. So, that happens. There is one. I'm going to let you go on because I had a thought and it ran away from me, and I'm going to get back to it because I know it's really important and I wanted to say it.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about 1917, how it sort of came short. Joker also made history, having the first female composer not only nominated but winning, which I think was fantastic. And they tied that up nicely with having the first female composer conduct all of the original score music, which was a nice little touch. And
it was great, but that was another thing that I just thought, especially with the three women up there. I know, I get it, listeners. I am a man, and I'm saying this from my perspective, and I applaud this. I think it's fantastic, and I think it should happen organically. I suppose it has to happen inorganically first. Mm-hmm. And I loved it. I love that. But wouldn't it be great if all of a sudden, if they just said she's directing, we now have this woman, conducting the orchestra. It just sounded like the Academy was trying too hard. And again, I said this before, because they felt like they're trying to distract me from the real issue, that there wasn't enough female representation. There wasn't enough other kind of, black representation or Indian representation, whatever kind of representation is being out. It was too white. It was too male. Mm-hmm. So please don't read my annoyance at these things as thinking that we're being hit on the head with it. I think we need to be, but I just think it doesn't make up for the lack of diversity.
No, and I think that's the major key, where you can find fault with the method that they're doing to it, where if it doesn't eventually address the root problem, what's it all for?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's interesting. Hollywood only won 2 awards. I was very sure that Tarantino was going to pick up his 3rd original screenplay win.
Mm-hmm.
Were you thinking that was going to happen as well?
Yeah, actually, I did. That was one of my. I thought it'd be Irishman or Tarantino. It's always fun seeing the guys that are out there eccentric and wild and will say anything and really don't care get up on stage.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's always. So I always want to hear from those people. I'm surprised Tarantino didn't win. That is such a good movie. And when you do find people that dislike the film, they seem to dislike it for the reasons, exactly like you were saying, they dislike it for reasons that made me like it. Mm-hmm. You know, the kind of self-serving aspect to it. I think Brad Pitt sort of nailed it in his speech when he said, perhaps Tarantino, talking about the recent trials in the States with Trump, whose name was never mentioned once, I don't think.
That's what he wanted. That's what he wanted.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. When he said maybe Tarantino will make this film, and in the end, the adults win. And this is what we love, and I'm just about Tarantino is that. Dare I say, I won't actually say the ending of Hollywood, but it was so satisfying. Mm-hmm. Just like the ending of Inglourious Bastards. It's so satisfying. And what makes that film so strong that people are forgetting is the whole element of Margot Robbie as Sharon Tate watching herself on screen and celebrating her stardom. Mm-hmm. It touches me. And I think that is what Tarantino does so well. He looks at the ugliness of history and he twisted it to make us feel good about something that I suppose we can never feel good about, but he gives us an alternative universe.
For a few short hours, at least. For
a few short hours. And can I talk a little bit about Hollywood now? I don't know, and I try to find out if the character that Brad Pitt plays, mm-hmm. in the real story, there was a stuntman named Shorty. And you know about this, okay? Mm-hmm. For those who don't, there's a stuntman named Shorty. He was one of the first to be murdered mm-hmm. by the Manson clan. So when Brad Pitt goes to the ranch, Shorty was picked up by a woman on the ranch. That woman brought him back. He was found dead, just a torso. And I thought, even though we do know his name, I forgot who Brad Pitt's name was in the film. And I thought, is this Shorty? Is mm-hmm. this Shorty? Which that scene on the ranch was the glass of milk scene at the opening. Bastards. Yeah, in Glorious Bastards. And I just sat there watching it, and there's a scene when it cuts, and we go to a different scene with, I believe it was, I think it was with Leonardo, where someone says Shorty, and I just thought that little touch, he's playing with us, mm-hmm. he's making you think, yeah, that's Shorty. So, yeah.
I felt the same way because there was do you know the podcast You Must Remember This?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so when she did the season on the whole Manson murders, I was absolutely glued to that and learned so much information, which really helped going into the movie. Yeah. And listening to that and watching Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the parallels, there's so many where he clearly did his homework as well.
So she talks about this in that? She talks about Shorty?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so she did an entire season, I think it's 8 or 9 episodes of it where it's all about the Manson murders and going very in depth to basically everyone that even had some peripheral connection to it. And she did spend some time talking about Shorty Shea, who was the stuntman, one of the mm-hmm. first ones to get murdered. So yeah.
Yeah, and so when Brad Pitt hoops the guy and he goes flying, which is very cinematic. That was the Shorty payback, mm-hmm. I thought emotionally. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, I agree completely. I think the last thing I really want to kind of talk about is if you had any snubs. For me, I was disappointed with the animated feature category. This is a category that has flummoxed me for years, mostly due to the fact that most of the members are either Disney or Pixar employees. So by virtue of that, they're the ones that are most likely going to win. I thought this year, with Frozen 2 completely being shut out, that finally they would, do the right thing and not award one of the big studios with a win. And sure enough, Toy Story 4, probably the weakest of the entire series, ended up winning, where I would have been more than happy with either Klaus or I Lost My Body or Missing Link, because I think they're all fantastic films.
Yeah, I'd really draw a blind eye, blind ear, or you don't have a blind ear.
Deaf ear.
To those categories. It meant more to me when, my daughter and I would go see those films. I did not like Toy Story. You're right, it's the weakest. I didn't even like the best Toy Story. I'm just not that guy. But definitely, that was the wrong choice in that case. But the biggest snub for me was Scorsese. Mm-hmm. I was really, really happy that he was selected, he was quoted on stage by the winner for Best Director, that he was honored appropriately. And I really hope Scorsese felt the love of his community, because more than once people talked about...
I think it was hard to miss. There was definitely a very pointed, we honor you and we appreciate you for everything that you've done for the history of cinema, because it extends far beyond what he does behind the camera, because he's such a vital person with his work revitalizing old film prints in museums and things like that. He is more than just a director to a lot of these people, and I think he was appropriately acknowledged.
Yet that made me happy. Mm-hmm. That the entire auditorium stood up for him, mm-hmm. as far as I could tell. And he didn't walk away. I don't know if he gets disappointed. You would think somebody that far in his career, he's a legend. He is a true maestro. Mm-hmm. I don't think I wonder if it really gets him. I guess only his closest friends will know, unless he talks about it. But, I felt that The Irishman is a hugely underrated film. Even I love it, and people who hate the movie are going to say it's hugely overrated. But people who talk about the lack of women in the film, I think that Anna Paquin's role is stunning. What she does in visuals, it can't be done with words. So yeah, Irishman was the big disappointment for me. I do think it was the best film of the year.
I think if it was an hour shorter, it would have worked a lot better for me. Mm-hmm. And Pacino and Pesci were fantastic. De Niro was the one that didn't work it for me, especially when he was playing the youngest version of himself. Those are the parts that really didn't sort of jive well with me, where I think De Niro just doesn't really have it as much anymore. Pacino, I've written him off long ago, but this was proof that maybe with the right direction and the right script, and often he gets cast as being able to play this, loud, over-the-top character, and it's too much. This time it actually really suited what he was able to bring to the table, especially contrasted with Pesci's quietness and more inwardness. The two of them worked off each other very well, of showing the two dichotomies of what you expect in a gangster movie sort of thing. And so I really appreciated those two performances. But De Niro's was the one that really didn't work for me.
So you saw it once?
Only once. I don't think I can marathon it a second time.
I hope your wife talks you into doing it again.
Oh,
I thought
she
De Niro
won't.
was wonderful. I thought De Niro was wonderful. And I do hear from a lot of people about De Niro, and there's people who generally, I know you're a film historian, and I know you see your stuff. I'm not questioning that, but for a lot of people, De Niro is the De Niro of the last 20 years, mm-hmm. and he has done his and Pacino too, his best work in the 70s.
Yes.
But, it's like somebody once told me about Francis Ford Coppola, and they dismissed him, and he just he can't make movies anymore. He can't make movies. He can't make movies. And I go, you know what? You just have to make the conversation. If you make just the conversation, you need to be honored for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't just do that. He did The Godfather. Then he did Godfather 2. You know, and then he's done a number of other films what came before The Conversation that was quite good?
Apocalypse Now.
You know. So sometimes what you've done recently really isn't what you are about or who you are about. And I think that about these actors. You know, this is one of the things I try to avoid reading on Twitter was comments about Pacino, comments about De Niro, etc. Because they've earned our respect, you know? And also, particularly De Niro, politically, man, he's the man.
He is. Mm-hmm. I will not fault him for that. And I do think this was De Niro's best performance in a long time for me. I just think it was not fully there for me.
Okay, Netflix or in the theater?
I saw it on Netflix.
Okay, you got to go
again. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. I understand where you're coming from. And I did hear that people experienced it much differently for those that did go and see it at TIFF if they're lucky enough to go to those screenings or the like, as opposed to just seeing it on Netflix.
Okay, so I had a beer just before I saw it at TIFF. And I had to use the washroom just as the screen opened. I went, I'll watch the first scene. I stayed in my seat the whole time.
Really?
I could not leave.
That's impressive.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't remember what it was that I was going to say that would have been so brilliant, but I had an idea anyway.
I think my last sort of snub was I really enjoyed American Factory, the documentary.
Yeah.
But for Sama, I don't think I've been as moved by a movie as I have in that one. Were you able to catch up with that documentary?
Yeah, that's the one I saw.
Okay.
And yes, but why you're talking about American Factory?
Yes.
It won, didn't it?
Yeah, it did, yes. That's what I'm saying, where I would have preferred it to be for Sama to win.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So no, American Factory is the only one I saw.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I liked it very much.
I did too. I think it was quite an interesting one. I think it's impossible to walk away from that movie and not really question everything that is being run by our society and those larger questions that we need to answer. But For Sama was a film that has touched me in a way that I didn't think that a documentary had it. I was emotional the entire way through, and it's a shame that The Cave, which is basically the exact same subject matter, they were both nominated for the same year, because it really makes me dismiss The Cave that much more, because For Sama was such a phenomenal work of art.
What struck me about the acceptance of that film, the American Factory, is that the director acknowledged the other directors, and she acknowledged that all of them risked their lives. And when she said that, and then she said, "My film's from Ohio."
Yeah,
it was almost like she's saying, "We'll accept this award. We won. We're going to accept it, but you guys risked your lives." And I thought that was a worthy point of her mentioning. I think also a worthy point worth mentioning is that you've seen every single film in the category, including nominated films, right? You've seen every single one. That you deserve an award.
Well, thank you very much. It's something that I torture myself through every year, and this was the first time I've ever completed it 100%, and I'm quite proud of that. It's funny. I never really think of this as my own little personal challenge. And then yesterday when I was watching the Oscars, a friend was like, I was talking to my husband and he said, does it help you or does it make it worse when you're trying to pick out the winners? And I'm like, you know what? I've actually never thought about that. And the fact that I only ended up predicting 16 out of the 24, maybe it means that it hinders me a little bit.
I don't think, I always think it's weird when people say, oh, I don't want to fill out the ballot. I haven't seen any of the movies. You don't have to. Your guess is as good as mine. I would not have picked Parasite. Even though I thought Parasite was a really good film, I would not have picked it over 1917.
That, I think if you were picking Parasite to win, I think it's one of those times where you're going with your gut and your gut ended up being right.
Yeah. I think my gut's overrated.
Well, Thom, I really appreciate you coming here and talking with me. If people want to read more of your writing or interact with you, what's the best way to do that?
Well, Original Sin. So it's original-CIN, and Google that. It is where I write my reviews. Other than that, I show up at film festivals. I show up at various places just doing talks and stuff like that. You can follow me on Twitter, which is at Reel, R-E-E-L, Thom, T-H-O-M, and my last name is Ernst, E-R-N-S-T, so at Reel Thom Ernst.
Well, I'm going to make sure I link to that in the show notes. That way people can find you. And if you want to get into it them about The Irishman or Parasite or things like that, you can do that.
I don't. I won't. If you tweet something nasty about it, I'll just go find it.
No one will do that. Of course not. Well, Thom, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Once again, I want to thank my guest, Thom Ernst, for coming on and talking all about the Oscars. It was a real pleasure, and I hope you check out his work. I also want to thank Aesthetic Magazine for presenting the show, and Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music. Now make sure you follow Contra Zoom Pod on all platforms. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Contra Zoom Pod, and make sure you follow the show wherever you listen to podcasts, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and yes, we are now on Google Play. So please make sure you subscribe wherever you get us. And you know what? If you feel so inclined, please leave us a rating or review.